When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. What is reason? What does it mean to think about a problem, whether to buy a new computer, whether to switch careers, whether to end a relationship, whether to run a red light? What does it mean to think about those rationally? Scores and scores of philosophers and random people drinking at bars have weighed in on these questions, but the most concentrated and influential collective writing on this question occurred during the Enlightenment, roughly between 1650 and 1800, the end of the 30 Years' War and the end of the French Revolution. One of the core lessons stressed during this period of dense intellectual activity, and I'm painting with a purposefully broad brush here over lots of thinkers strewn over lots of countries, is that the world should be viewed and organized according to reason and science, as opposed to 5 things. 1. Myths, useful but unprovable stories about the past. 2. Superstition, personal or social habits based on a faulty view of the physical or spiritual world. 3. Revelation, truths or lessons revealed privately to one person or a small group of people. 4. Social tradition, a reverence for how previous people and societies have organized themselves. And 5. Unquestionable authorities, people or institutions whose demands for loyalty leave no room for doubting or criticizing their conclusions. In contrast, many of the intellectual reformers and revolutionaries associated with bold ideas about science and democracy during the Enlightenment stressed that claims about the world must be publicly verified and re-verified again and again, rather than asserted by force. In short, many Enlightenment thinkers married science to reason, asking us to ask unorthodox questions about our world, to test the answers we get to those questions according to experience and exacting methods, and then debate the truthfulness of competing answers that we get to those questions without limits or ego. That's what it means to reason individually and collectively, and in turn, that's what it means to live and participate in a democracy. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Nafis Alam. Nafis is a professor of social work who researches viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement, and open inquiry. Nafis, tell us an argument story.
Sure. So back when I was starting my master's education, it was 2012, 2013, around that time, during orientation, I was asked to write a reflection piece on an article by Peggy McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. There's about 26 items of white privilege. And when I dissected that and unpacked those areas of privilege, I came to the understanding that it's not so much white privilege, but green privilege. Almost every one of those points I could connect back to socioeconomic status being the prevailing factor over whiteness in this particular article. So that was my reflection paper on this piece, and I got the worst grade that I've ever gotten in my life. And now I am a bit of a social experimenter, hence why I do what I do. So I wrote the same exact paper, same number of sentences, same references, except every point I made a counterpoint. So it was essentially the opposite of my perspective. And this was back in the day when listeners, if they're old enough, will remember there were bulletin boards and thumbtacks you would, post papers on. They wanted to do that. Professors wanted to post my paper on the bulletin board. That's when I knew that I was being judged not based on the quality of my work, but whether or not my perspective aligned with the professors and the universities.
Yeah.
So that inspired me to become a professor. That was a moment when I said, I need to be in this role.
Yeah.
And now, of course, I'm not going to, being a professor means being open to different perspectives and not shedding, perspectives that I myself don't have down. So that's been my goal as a professor, and that's what led to me doing what I do today.
Sketch, if you will, set up the argument, set up this position of white privilege, and then set up the intervention you were trying to make and presumably still are trying to make.
So if white privilege does exist, which I believe it does, I don't believe that it exists to the extent to which some people believe that it does. But if a solution to white privilege were to exist, it would be calling it out and specifically understanding that this is whiteness and not socioeconomic status or something that you're born into. We need to etch out whether or not it is indeed white privilege or just privilege. Once we've done that and we find areas and pockets of white privilege, education is the number one thing I believe, that educating people and helping them understand that there is no advantage to being inherently white or inherently black or inherently brown. I think that's where it begins. I think those who are racist or who are sexist lack education. I still believe in benevolence. I think, giving people the benefit of the doubt is the best starting point. Now, after a while, if you learn a little bit more about a specific person or a specific group, you might say, okay, they don't deserve the benefit of the doubt anymore. But to start off in a place of positivity, I think is a good start.
Is it fair to say that you were trying to decenter the way in which we focus on perhaps skin color or race, and then have it exist alongside the way we focus on material distribution, wealth, access to resources, education, etc.? In other words, those aren't the same thing, and we should recognize the extent to which each has its own lane.
Yeah, I certainly am. I think it's a little bit too easy of a route, and people opt for this must be racist when it might be something a little bit more complex. So it's an easy thing to go to whenever you feel like you've been discriminated against or you've been treated unfairly, to say, well, there's a clear difference in skin color, so let's just assume that that's the reason why this person has gotten preferential treatment over another. But if we dig down, scratch a little bit deeper, we'll find that there's a great deal of complexity as to why things happen the way that they do.
It sounds like you're making an argument for complexity, but it also sounds like you're making an argument that cuts to the heart of a single issue, and that issue is class.
In this example, I personally believe that socioeconomic status has greater influence on privilege than race and gender and sexual orientation, things like that. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
I think that the literature also suggests that this is true. And it sort of makes common sense too, doesn't it? If if I grew up with money, regardless of the color of my skin, like I would be the leader of that particular neighborhood. They would want me to fund whatever projects they want to fund, and they're gonna treat me with privilege. So, and that means if I'm a brown person or a black person living in a white neighborhood, if I am the richest person there, then of course they're going to treat me in a privileged manner in order for me to contribute and invest in that particular neighborhood.
This is an argument I think I've certainly heard before, kind of a class-based critique of so-called woke ideology post 2012-13, give or take, right? Why do you think class is easily overlooked as a category of identity over race or gender, sexuality, etc.?
If you're asking me that question, my belief is that socioeconomic status is a bit more complex. It's more of a moving target. Also, you as an individual can change your socioeconomic status from dramatically. You can go from lower class to upper class. It takes a lot of luck and a lot of work, but you can do it. Race, you can't change. Gender, in some circles, would suggest that you cannot change that. Because socioeconomic status is something that you can have influence on, I believe that is why it's not held to the regard that race is, because race is, you'll be the race that you are today 10 years from now. So it's an easy way to make it permanent or make it seem permanent when it might not be.
There's a kind of like rags to riches aspirational narrative that applies to class. And so we don't want to hamstring our future selves who are going to be very rich by regulating and making being rich negative today.
Exactly.
Let's come back to the original controversy, the one that you say inspired you to pick a whole line of work. Was there an exchange, a debate about your essay, or was just sort of a grade and a bunch of negative aspersions about the green argument you made over white privilege?
Well, I was allowed to revise and resubmit the paper after meeting with the professor, and I wouldn't call it a debate because it was very clear that I was in the position of lacking privilege. My old football coach would say something, and I didn't understand it until this very moment. He would say, back in high school, you have to play the game before you change the game. And this is the moment that it made sense because I did not have the power to change my professor's mind because I was still learning to play the game as a young master's student. Now that I am a professor, I have the ability to change the game now that I've played it for as long as I have. And, I've done a lot of work with Heterodox Academy, with FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I'll be presenting there, in a couple of weeks. So now I have the opportunity to change the game, but only because I've learned how to play the game. But back then, I did not challenge my professors. I wanted to get an idea of what I needed to do. But I was hitting record in my mind and thinking, okay, so this is exactly the kind of professor that I do not want to be. And now I practice that in that, if a student comes up with a perspective that I personally don't agree with, one, I really don't share my perspective with my students. But if I inherently don't agree with it, I challenge myself to be open-minded to it in as an antonym to a professor that I had back then.
This is a really generative kind of conflict in your life, it sounds like. In other words, I'm sure it was negative to experience at the time and deeply, deeply frustrating. And as you look back on it, shapes the way you relate to students, shapes your research, shapes the talks you give before audiences.
Quite often, human development is based on stress, isn't it? Like if we think about our past, and if you think about your past too, I'm sure there have been negative experiences that have been integral to the success that you've experienced as well.
I think I'm going to get "play the game to change the game" tattooed on me somewhere. That's just a good. That's just a good line from a football coach.
I know.
Let's talk about changing the game. What are some of the things that you try to do? Let's take it in different spheres of your professional work. So let's say with students, what are the things you try to do in interactions with students and classes you teach to promote viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement, and open inquiry?
Yeah. So one of the major things that I do is in the classroom environment, as a social work professor, we get into topics that are very contentious: abortion, gun rights, so on and so forth. And of course, students will come in with their perspectives, and I encourage them to not change their mind. I tell them this is a classroom, not a cult. So whatever we learn here over the course of 14 sessions should not change who you are fundamentally, because it is a classroom of education, not a cult of indoctrination. And so in doing that, when students disagree with one another, and they often tend to in my classrooms, I'll ask them to make arguments on behalf of the other position, which isn't anything new. It's been done for centuries now in classrooms. But in doing so, I ask my students, even if you make a compelling argument to the contrary, I want you to stay strong in who you are, and I only want you to consider the opposition in order to strengthen your current perspective. Sort of like a salmon swimming upstream and becoming strong. That's what you're doing here. By considering those opposing and conflicting viewpoints, I don't want you to go change who you are. Again, this is not a cult. I want you to consider those viewpoints because you are better equipped to handle it when people debate you and ask you, well, why do you believe this and why do you believe that, when this is logical and that's logical? And when students do that, what ends up happening is that when several students do that, they'll begin understanding that, okay, so I'm being heard because my opposition is making the argument that I'm making logically. And now I can express that I'm hearing those other students too by making their positional argument. And now it brings people together, but still creates an environment where we can be individuals within that group.
It sounds like you're balancing two interests there. One is pluralism and the value of multiple different competing perspectives via debate. And certainly the ancient Greeks and ancient rhetoricians practiced those principles of arguing the other side and perspective taking. And we find that in debates and debate-based pedagogy in law schools throughout America today. Let me ask you, and you also balance that with authenticity, right? Being who you are, using these debates to strengthen your existing position. Just want to ask you a quick follow-up about that authenticity piece. Why not just embrace the first one and say, let's have 1,000 viewpoints and see which one impacts you the most? In other words, why position it to say, use this as an activity to strengthen how you already feel?
Undergraduate students, for the most part, are still adults. And as adults, they have done the work of developing who they are and becoming who they are. Now, will they change? Of course, I'm, almost half a century old and I'm still changing. But I don't want the classroom environment to be an environment where students change who they are fundamentally. That's more something that they should do on their own. So even though I'm telling them not to change who they are fundamentally, it's inevitable that when they go home, on their drive home, or even when they're making dinner and just like dozing off and zoning out,
Yeah.
they'll change who they are fundamentally if that's what's meant to happen. I just don't want to be the catalyst of that happening, because again, I want my classroom environment to be truly inclusive of different viewpoints while acknowledging those opposing and conflicting viewpoints. And if
Yeah.
I were to go in that direction of saying, well, choose the most logical path, and then students say, well, this is logical, but this is who I want to be, there's a conflict there. And we're all hypocrites at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so I want students to stay who they are while still considering those opposing viewpoints, and allow that change to happen, if it happens, gradually instead of suddenly in those 14 sessions.
The story you told to jump off the show is fascinating in light of this too. And I wonder if when you revisit that story and the change it made in your life in terms of how you decided to devote your career and spend your time and make money and influence the world, was that you extending who you are, becoming the person you were sort of always meant to be? Or was that a change?
I believe that that's who I was always meant to be. And of course, it's sort of like confirmation bias, right? Because I have, etched out my little corner in this space. I'm doing quite well here, but it might have been other things, But in my mind, I feel like I'm doing the work that I'm truly passionate about, because I'll go around talking about and talk about how important it is to have that unity while still having individuality. And so if even 2 or 3 people during a 1,000-person, audience are inspired by that and feel like, okay, so I can be friends with that person, even though they're voting for the party that I'm not going to be voting for, I feel like that gives me goosebumps. I don't know that it's happening. Certainly the audience members don't necessarily keep in touch with me, although sometimes I'll get emails or snail mail messages saying that, thank you for this, and it really inspired me to do such and such. That's really what fills my cup.
You talked for a second about your classroom engagement with students based on the values you preach: constructive engagement, viewpoint, diversity, open inquiry. Let's talk about your research for a moment. How do you practice what you preach in your research and in talks you share with other audiences outside the classroom?
Yeah, so my research studies, I always have a conversation about what could have been done differently, implications, limitations, some other ways that to approach a certain topic. One of the other areas that I research is sports social work. So whenever I've done a research study, let's say on non-traditionally aesthetic bodies, we talk about whether or not it's better to be traditionally attractive or to be a better athlete. For example, with offensive linemen who are traditionally not aesthetic, but make $20-30 million a year protecting the quarterback. So we have these point counterpoint perspectives. I've also written an article on transgender athlete inclusion. That was a point counterpoint piece as well with my friend Matt Moore over in University of Kentucky. And, we practice this and we create an environment in literature through those point counterpoint articles where people can read it and say, okay, so these are 2 academics that disagree, or even 1 academic that disagrees and shows those opposing viewpoints. Maybe I can be nuanced in my thinking too. And that's what I aim to do in my publications.
If you could snap your fingers and change the argumentative and research environment in American culture broadly, and certainly in colleges and universities specifically, what would you do? In other words, if you could design a system that protects the values that you've dedicated your career to pursuing, what would that system look like?
I would have public scholarship be factored into tenure.
Hmm.
The average peer-reviewed article gets read by 10 people in its lifetime, which if I'm putting 9 months of work into something, I would hope that 11 people would read it and not 10. My popular press pieces, however, some of them published in Pulitzer Prize winning newspapers, sometimes they get 50,000 views, so 50,000 reads. So the impact, we're supposed to prioritize impact in academia, yet with peer-reviewed pieces, there's minimal impact, although the quality of that work is much greater, I will admit, than popular press pieces. So I think one of the ways that I've tried to do things is that I'll write a peer-reviewed piece. It's been peer-reviewed, it's been published, and now I will publish sort of a different version of it in a popular press source. So this way, it gets out to the general public. So I would really change higher education if I could snap my fingers to have professors and faculty members prioritize popular press pieces.
So first, let's figure out how to get some academic research out of a so-called ivory tower and have a broader impact and tell better data-driven, evidenced stories using the powers of education that some of us in the academy have gotten over the years. As somebody who's written a few books that I would say less than a dozen people have read, your words mean a lot to me. What's something else you would do? And let's just close on this. So one, let's make sure that we're not cloistered away talking to ourselves or barely talking to ourselves with the same number of people that are on an offensive line read something that it took me a year or two to write. But then second, what would you do to take aim at this professor and the professors and other people in the culture, not just the academy, who take a point of view like the one who rejected your essay back in 2012, 2013? What can we do to change minds around that angle?
To help professors understand that they are an educator and not an activist in the classroom is number one. Number two, and this is more of a long-term thing, would be to help adults, professors, understand that you don't need other people to believe what you believe in order for you to continue believing in that thing. All too often children act this way, where they will try to convince you of something because they're trying to convince themselves of that thing. Adults, are sometimes no different. And so they'll also believe that, well, I'm stronger in my position because I convinced 30 of my students to believe in this one thing.
Yeah.
And now I feel good about where I stand. That just doesn't need to be the case. Real strength comes in standing alone and being comfortable standing alone. And I think that needs to be communicated.
Yeah, great title of a book, Conflict is Not Abuse, and then another one is Disagreement is Not Threatening.
Exactly.
Nafis Alam, thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.